I'm Savannah. Standing in the middle of the church hall, the silence was deafening. Marjorie, my ex-mother-in-law, stood at the head of the table, her face a mask of shock and anger, while the rest of the room stared at me, their expressions a mix of disbelief and awe. Just moments ago, I had turned the tables on her, exposing the truth behind her false accusations. It all started when I received a certified envelope. The very fact that it was certified made me feel a sense of foreboding. Inside was an invoice for $80,000, claiming I owed it for the wedding Marjorie had paid for. It was 4 months after my divorce from Ethan, and this invoice felt like a cruel twist of fate. At the bottom of the invoice, in her sharp, angular handwriting, she'd written, "Family pays its debts." I remembered standing at my kitchen counter, reading that invoice 3 times. The first time, I let out a short, bitter laugh. The second time, I noticed the details, the invoice number, the date, and the line item that said wedding services rendered. It was as if my marriage had been nothing more than a business transaction to her. The third time, my hands started to shake. It wasn't the money that scared me. I'd dealt with large numbers in my bookkeeping career. It was the realization that Marjorie had reduced 7 years of my life to a single line of debt. Then, I received a text from Ethan's younger sister, Lily. "You know what you owe," it read. It was like a slap in the face, and I knew then that this wasn't just Marjorie's doing. The whole family had been conspiring against me, painting me as a thief in their twisted narrative. I grew up in a small town called Riverdale, a place with a tight-knit community and a long memory. Reputation was everything there. I'd spent years building mine, one careful invoice at a time. But when I walked into the local grocery store one day, I felt the change. 2 women I'd known for years stopped their conversation abruptly when they saw me. One gave me a cold smile, and the other avoided my eyes. On my way out, I heard a low whisper, "She cleaned out that whole family." I realized then that Marjorie had sent not just an invoice but a verdict to the whole town. Before I became the woman they accused me of being, I was a girl who grew up in a modest home. My mother worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, and my father was absent. I learned early on that numbers were reliable, while people could be deceptive. I put myself through community college, got a bookkeeping certification, and slowly built a client list. By the time I was in my early 20s, I'd saved enough to buy a small 2-bedroom house in town, a source of great pride for me. I was always the one who fixed things quietly. When a client's books were in disarray, I'd stay late to sort them out without a word. When someone I loved was in financial trouble, I'd reach for my checkbook before they could even finish asking. I kept receipts, filing them away like treasures, but I never showed them to anyone. I thought it was an act of grace, that true generosity didn't need to be proven. But I should tell you about Marjorie. She grew up on a struggling ranch and married into another one. She spent her life counting every penny, and in her mind, every dollar she spent on her children was an investment. When Ethan and I got engaged, she offered to pay for the wedding. I was young and grateful, thinking it was an act of kindness. But now I know it was a calculated move. At our rehearsal dinner, she leaned in and said, "You married up, Savannah. The least you can do is pay up." I laughed then, thinking she was joking. But she wasn't. Our marriage was filled with small financial problems. Ethan was a kind-hearted but irresponsible man. When his truck loan went underwater in our 2nd year of marriage, I paid it off, $18,400. When he got a DUI in the 3rd year, I hired a lawyer and covered the fines, $9,200. When Marjorie's roof was damaged in a storm, I wrote a check for $14,500. There were also back taxes he'd hidden and a failed business venture he'd invested in. Every time, I paid without hesitation, thinking it was part of being a family. But something deep inside me, a remnant of my childhood, made me keep records of every payment. The end of my marriage was quiet. One morning, I woke up and realized I'd been the only responsible adult in our relationship for years. The final straw was when Ethan, at Marjorie's urging, moved money out of our joint savings to cover one of her ranch expenses without telling me. When I confronted him, he didn't see the problem. That's when I knew it was over. I met with a lawyer, gathered our records, and filed for divorce. I took nothing that wasn't rightfully mine, just my little house in town. 4 months after the divorce, that certified envelope arrived. The next morning, I called my divorce attorney, Mr. Thompson. He laughed when I read him the invoice, saying it was a piece of paper with no legal standing. But he also warned me that socially, it was a different story. Marjorie was trying to win in the court of public opinion, not in a real courtroom. 9 days later, I received a second letter. It was typed on fancy paper, signed by Carl, Marjorie's distant cousin who worked at a law office in a neighboring town and always wanted to be seen as a lawyer. The letter threatened small claims court and suggested community mediation at the local church. I knew then that Marjorie was trying to pull the whole town into this, using the church as a stage to humiliate me. Lily took it a step further by posting something vague but pointed in the community group. Praying for our family in a hard season. Some people take and never think about what they owe, she wrote. By the end of the day, I'd received texts from several people asking if I was okay, and an older woman I barely knew messaged me to say she was sorry for what I was going through, clearly believing the false narrative. I was tempted to defend myself, to pour out the whole truth in a long, angry post. But then I heard my own voice in my head, the voice that had always kept me calm and rational. I don't argue with numbers people. I show them the numbers, I thought. So, I deleted the post and opened the green folder I'd kept for 7 years. That night, I made a decision. I could have fought Marjorie on her terms, but I knew that would only lead to more chaos. Instead, I decided to use my strength, documentation. I called my accountant, Mr. Harris, and asked him to prepare a formal itemized statement of all the money I'd paid on behalf of the family over the years. Opening that green folder was like opening a Pandora's box. It was filled with bank statements, transfer confirmations, and photocopies of cleared checks. As I sorted through the papers, I saw a version of myself I'd almost forgotten, a woman who had been so generous, yet so unacknowledged. At the bottom of the folder, I found an old receipt from a local feed store. On the back, in Ethan's father's handwriting, was a note, "Keep your receipts, Savannah." Kindness and proof were never enemies. I remembered the day he'd given it to me. It was a few months before his death. He'd asked me to help him sort the ranch's books because his eyes were failing, and Marjorie was too possessive of the ledger. After we finished, he'd written that note and pressed it into my hand. I'd thought it was just a simple piece of advice, but now I realized he'd been warning me. I added up all the expenses, the truck loan, the DUI lawyer and fines, Marjorie's roof, Ethan's back taxes, the failed business venture, Lily's college tuition, and even the cost of Ethan's father's funeral. The total came to $83,800. I'd already paid more than the $80,000 Marjorie was claiming I owed. A few days later, Mr. Harris called with the official statement. The total was the same as what I'd calculated. I knew then that I had the evidence I needed to clear my name. Then, I received an invitation to the ranch's 40th anniversary dinner at the church hall. It came through Ethan, a text that was clearly Marjorie's idea. She was setting up a stage to publicly shame me. But I saw it as an opportunity to tell the truth in front of everyone. I prepared for the dinner with calm determination. I got the statement from Mr. Harris and a letter from Mr. Thompson stating that the invoice had no legal basis. I laid out my clothes the night before, choosing simple, modest attire. On the night of the dinner, I drove to the church hall. As I walked in, I could feel the tension in the air. Marjorie sat at the head of the table, looking like a queen on her throne. Lily gave me a smug smile, and Carl hovered nearby, pretending to be important. Ethan avoided my eyes. I found a seat in the middle of the room and placed my envelopes on the table. I sat there, waiting for Marjorie to make her move. Marjorie stood up and began her speech. She talked about the ranch, about Ethan's father, and then she turned to me. I paid for your wedding, $80,000 out of my savings because I believed in you. But when you left my son, you left that debt behind, she said, her voice filled with false sorrow. Family pays its debts. When are you going to make it right? I stood up slowly. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for me to break down. But I was calm. Thank you, Marjorie. You're right about one thing. Family pays its debts, I said. Her eyes widened in surprise. I reached for the first envelope and took out Mr. Thompson's letter. I'm not here to hide behind the law, but I think you all deserve to know that this invoice has no legal basis, I said, reading the letter aloud. I watched as a few faces in the room changed expression. Carl suddenly became very interested in his shoes. Then, I took out Mr. Harris's statement. This is a record of everything I paid for this family over 7 years, I said, and I began to read the items one by one. As I spoke, the room grew quieter and quieter. When I reached the line about Lily's tuition, her face went white. And when I mentioned the cost of Ethan's father's funeral, Marjorie let out a small gasp. I added up the total, $83,800. Marjorie, you billed me for $80,000. But years before you ever wrote that invoice, I'd already paid $83,800. By your own logic, this family owes me $3,800, I said. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Marjorie's composure shattered. She started to scream, calling me names and accusing me of ruining the family celebration. But the room was no longer on her side. Ethan finally spoke up, saying, Mom, stop. She's right. It's all true. I didn't raise my voice. I folded the statement neatly and placed it in front of Marjorie. You can keep the invoice. Consider it paid with interest. I don't want the money. I just want you to stop spreading lies about me, I said. As I turned to leave, an older woman near the aisle got my coat for me. A few men nodded at me respectfully, and a woman touched my arm and said, God bless you, honey. Nobody looked at Marjorie. I drove home that night, feeling lighter than I had in years. The next week, the certified letters stopped. Lily texted me an apology, and Ethan sent me a check for $3,800. I didn't cash the check. Instead, I framed it next to the old receipt from the feed store and hung them over my desk. This whole experience taught me that kindness should be accompanied by self-respect, and keeping proof of your worth is not a sign of mistrust but a safeguard against those who would try to rewrite your story. So, if you've ever been in a similar situation, remember to keep your receipts. They might just be the key to setting the record straight.